Okay, so the last thing that we're going to talk about with the nervous system are ascending and descending tracts, and we're going to break down the descending tracts a little bit further with our autonomic nervous system. So first, if you remember, your ascending tract is coming up, right? So that would be sensory and would include sensory neurons. And your descending tracts are going down and out, so those would give me motor information to the effectors. A tract is a whole bundle of axons. So sometimes you'll read about pathways versus tracts versus nerves. Here's a really easy way to remember it. If I'm going from point A to point B, that's a pathway. Part of that pathway is going to be in my central nervous system, so that will be a tract. Part of it will be in the peripheral nervous system, so that's going to be a nerve. So if you think about a pathway as being directions to get from one place to another, like my brain to my big toe, or directions to get from my house to the Detroit Zoo, part of that pathway will be on the highway, and part of that pathway will be on back roads. So you can kind of think of it that way. And you do not have to have all of these specific tracts memorized for this class. Now, we're going to end up coming back and filling in this table after I go over a couple of diagrams. So I want you kind of paying attention as I walk through the diagrams, and then we'll come back to this table and see if we can fill it out. So first of all, this is going to be a typical ascending tract. So my arrows, if you look, are going to be going this direction. So you can see the little tiny arrows heading up. If it's ascending, then we know that it is going to be sensory. And if you look, we've got one nerve starting out here. Another neuron picks up there. And then we have a third neuron, so these are synapses. Then a third neuron takes us to the cerebral cortex of the brain. Now remember we said that the thalamus is the relay station, right? It's my operator. So all those pathways or tracks come into my thalamus, and then it determines where it needs to go. And in this case, I'm going to a particular region of my cerebral cortex. So let's go back to our table. So this was an ascending tract. Just tuck myself over there. Its function, we said, is sensory. We had 3 neurons that got us there. We started out in the body. We ended in the cerebral cortex. Now, remember, the right side of your brain controls the left side of your body, and the left side of your brain controls the right side of your body. So that means at some point I have to cross over. So if I follow the red pathway here, notice I cross over in my spinal cord. So here's where I'm switching. If I follow the kind of yellowish, orangish one, then I cross over right here, and that's in my medulla oblongata. So where does it cross over? It could be the spinal cord. Or it could be the medulla. Let's take a look at a descending tract. So here's my ascending. Now I'm going the other direction. Well, if my arrows are going down, like we can see here, then we know that this is going to be motor. If I follow the neurons, we start in the cerebral cortex, and we have one. Notice we don't go through the thalamus because, remember, that's my operator sending things up. I have one neuron that goes all the way to here, and then I have a synapse, and then one more to the effector. So I'm only going to have 2 neurons, and I have to cross over. So if you notice, I'm going to cross over potentially here or here, which again, medulla or spinal cord. And then I'm going to end at some effector down here. So descending tract, function is motor, only 2 neurons now. We're going to start at the cerebral cortex, and we're going to end out in the body, specifically at the effectors, which are brain or spinal cord, or sorry, muscles or glands. Crossing over, same thing, spinal cord or medulla. So that just kind of gives you a quick summary of some of the key features between an ascending and a descending tract. Let's take a descending tract in my autonomic nervous system and break that into sympathetic and parasympathetic. Now, an important thing to realize is that sympathetic and parasympathetic typically run completely separate from each other. Most of the time, your body is either in sympathetic mode, which is fight or flight, or it's in parasympathetic mode, which is rest and digest. The exception to that would be sexual reproduction, because I need parasympathetic stimulation so that you can actually get blood flow to the structures necessary and glandular secretions necessary. And then you need sympathetic stimulation so that you can actually get ejaculation or peristalsis in the females. So in this case, you actually have cooperation between these two systems. Now, the sympathetic stimulation of the body has much longer lasting effects than the parasympathetic, and we'll see why that is in a minute. I'm going to come back to this in just a minute. So what I want to do is actually take a drawing and try to summarize the differences between sympathetic and parasympathetic with just a simple picture. So we have our sympathetic division, which we said is fight or flight, and we have our parasympathetic, which we said is rest and digest. Now these are motor, so they're both going to have only 2 neurons. So we're going to start up here at my cerebral cortex. We're going to have 1 neuron, and then we're going to have a second neuron, and it's going to end at the effector, which is going to be muscle or gland. Now, since this is involuntary, we're talking smooth or cardiac muscle, not skeletal. Okay. Now, parasympathetic is going to be the same because, again, it's descending or motor, so we only have 2 neurons, and we're going to end at the effectors. And again, these are going to be smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or glands. We're starting up here at the cerebral cortex. And remember, when we have these neurons, we may have a ganglion. We will have a ganglion here, where the cell bodies are in these peripheral nerves. So this is a ganglion. So we need one here. The nerve that is before, or the cell that is before the ganglion, would be the preganglionic neuron. And the one that is mostly after the ganglion would be the post. So this is my postganglionic neuron. Again, over here, this is my ganglionic neuron, and then this one down here is my post. Now, when that first neuron reaches its synapse, right here, or right here, this first neuron is going to have to release a neurotransmitter, right? So it is going to release the most common neurotransmitter that we use. So it's going to release acetylcholine, which means this neuron has to have receptors for acetylcholine. So it's going to have what we call cholinergic receptors. When we get to the effector, again, remember we're in rest and digest mode. The second neuron also has to release a neurotransmitter. So it's going to release ACH as well. Sorry, it's being a little glitchy on me today. And that means that my effector, which is again my smooth muscle, my cardiac muscle, or my gland, has to have cholinergic receptors. Now, if I'm in fight or flight mode, my preganglionic neuron, when it gets to this synapse, is going to release, again, ACH. Remember we said that we use ACH, or acetylcholine, for 3/4 of our autonomic nervous system, which means this neuron, again, has to have cholinergic receptors. But if I get to that smooth cardiac muscle or gland and I release ACH again, that smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or gland is going to say, oh, okay, I need to relax, because that's how the parasympathetic division tells me what to do. So I need a different neurotransmitter here. I want to be in fight or flight mode. So this neuron here is going to release a fight or flight neurotransmitter called norepinephrine, which means the effector has to have a different mailbox to receive that neurotransmitter. So it's going to have one called an adrenergic receptor. Because if you remember, epinephrine and norepinephrine used to be called adrenaline and noradrenaline, and some people probably still do. So the receptor is named by its old name. Adrenergic receptors bind adrenaline, which is now known as epinephrine. So this gives you kind of a visual where you can see very clearly, even by my color coding, that everything up here is the same. It's only different when we get to the effector. If I use ACH, it tells them to slow down. And if I use norepi, it tells them to be more active, or, depending on what the function is, possibly slow down. So remember, it's going to stimulate or inhibit whatever that action is, depending on what's going to be right for fight or flight, or rest and digest. And if you don't remember what those are, make sure that you go back and review that flow chart that gives you the divisions of the nervous system. Now, I want to mention an example of how understanding this can help us understand symptoms, for example, that we might see in a patient. If you've ever heard of sarin toxin, sarin neurotoxin was used by the head of Syria against the Syrians, and the reason that it was probably so condemned by every other country for being so like a horrible way, essentially, to treat these people is because of the type of physiological response it causes in people. It doesn't just kill them, it interferes with my ability to break down ACH in that neuromuscular junction. Now think about ACH as stimulating muscle to do something. Remember, we said it's used by 3/4 of your autonomic nervous system, but remember ACH is also used to stimulate skeletal muscle. If I don't break down that ACH, I'm going to continue to stimulate those muscles and also those glands. So what we see is a massive parasympathetic response. So think about parasympathetic responses when you're in rest and digest mode. What might be some of the symptoms? Well, we see lots and lots of fluids because, remember, drool, digestive function, urinary function, those are all tied to parasympathetic. So we see massive amounts of fluid just kind of erupting from the body. We're also affecting some of the muscles because we get muscle spasms and convulsions, which prevents them from being able to breathe. And it slows down the heart rate because parasympathetic, remember, depresses the heart function. It's a pretty terrible way to go. But we can understand those symptoms if we understand the two divisions and what they do. So we're going to end there, and I will post this PowerPoint up on eLearning if you want to take a look at the slides and some of the other slides that I didn't specifically use because I did drawings instead.